Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be in conversation with you, Preeti.
Thank you, Sindhu.
So okay, let's start with like the first thing that I was asking you before about when we were kids and we were reading like textbooks, like NCERT books or like history books, right? Yeah. Women's stories or women's status is like a tiny paragraph after like all the what the kings did, what they did, blah, 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 and there's a tiny sort of a thing. So that changed for me when I read Romila Thapar. I started thinking of this differently. So you, your work foregrounds feminist historiography,
yeah.
and you trace women's voices from dispersed archives. So I was first wondering, what inspired you to do this? Like, how did you start this journey?
So similar, if your teachers are going to be not Romila Thapar herself, but her student Kumkum Roy, the way that there's a story that I went to her for my first research paper, and I said, okay, I have two topics. One is something on women. I had this whole sort of notion on Devadasis and this and that. And I said, okay, something on food. She said, just pick the next one. Because there's always this idea that, okay, if I have to work on gender, it'll be, you know, about women were oppressed and how they are dying. But now with research, where what feminist historiography that you can stand on its shoulders and sort of write on, how the everydayness has brought in. So what I work on food is looking at that, yes, we used to study history in terms of the state, taxes, what did the king do. What feminist historiography helped do was sort of turn the gaze and see at everyday lives and everyday histories, which is also Uma Chakravarti's book, but irrespective. But that's something that sort of I took from feminist historiography. It doesn't have to be about the status of women, like you said, but about every aspect of life is a feminist aspect of life because you're giving that entire thing value. What happens in the household is as relevant and it sort of is reflective of what's happening in the polity, in the economy, in the society, in the state. So the clothes you wear, the food you eat, how all of these become sort of avenues of research, of identities, and that's something that feminist historiography has sort of helped open up avenues of research. Yeah.
That's really fascinating, isn't it, to think about history like that,
yeah.
right? And it's supposed to be, everybody should be thinking like that, but they don't, unfortunately. Yeah. So this is about resisting these sort of dominant narratives that have been, we were talking about this just before when we were walking here, about, you know, how we always think of Indian women as eternal victims of the patriarchy, right? Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about what counts as evidence? What counts as agency and memory? Because that's the thing. And also, whether silences hold meaning.
Yeah. So I'll help answer in the context of ancient India. So what are sources? In the context of ancient India, if you have access to written sources, which is something that Romila, Kumkum and I all work with, we work with texts. By the very nature, the very fact that it's going to be something that's written down, it's limited to the gaze and the audience of elite few of, you know, Brahmin men or the very elitist of Brahmin men. They are the only ones who have the power to write and the knowledge and the know-how of how to write. So if I have to write about, let's say, a forest dweller woman, all right, or a fisher woman or anybody else, I will not get their voice itself. But does that mean I can't write about them? No. And that's where I think the historian's method and sources come in handy. So how do these dominant texts, how do they see others all around them? Even where they are not mentioning people. There's so many things, right? Like from disability to children, we find so many conspicuous absences. So raising that fact itself, that in this kind of a text, these are the categories of society that are not mentioned, but we know they existed because they've always existed. That itself is part of reading the source and reading its silences. So the idea how history works, the step away from dominant narratives is to ask about a source, who has written it and for whom. That helps you see who is being left out or who is being conditioned in a certain way. So if I'm going to read the Dharma Shastras at face value, I'll feel that, yeah, caste existed, etc., etc. But that's not true. There's always been resistance, because even where they are negating that this should not happen, that means it's happening, right? So even in that negation, you know that there is always going to be some sort of agency of resistance as well. Some sliver is there as well.
See, that's something that I'm really interested in, right? When I think Romila Thabar says this, when you have these texts which are saying, you know, this is the fundamentalist way to be, that means people are not being that way, right?
Absolutely.
People are resisting that. People are doing something against that. Like so let's talk a little bit about, after you answer this question, maybe you can read either Kumkum or Romila's thing, that whichever fits in. A little bit about the epistemology and the pedagogy that goes into this kind of stuff. Because, you know, this is a transdisciplinary approach. You look, it's very intersectional. This is how you bring in sort of diverse narratives together into this, into the larger narrative that we're talking about. So tell me about that a little bit.
So that's part of research, that it's sort of intertwined. Our bread and butter is teaching. And the pedagogy has to sort of revise itself with the changing demographic of the students and the kind of questions that they ask. So again, with the students right now in class, for example, we are finding people, firstly, they have not been raised to be feudal. They will not just give you respect because you are a teacher. You really do have to earn their respect, which is, I think I'm absolutely fine with that. But that also means that they are curious. So they will not take a text and say, author has said this, so, you know, that's what I have to write in the exam, so it must be true. What they are asking is, how did the author come to this? Couldn't it have been X, Y, and Z? Maybe they read it wrong. So they always have that open mind, and of course aided a little bit by ChatGPT. So the pedagogy of teaching history currently, or bringing in this intersectional research, is also looking at the demographics of the classroom, when you are able to see around yourself that there are people from all walks of life. The classroom that I attended had first-generation learners, had non-Hindi speakers, had non-English speakers, all sitting together in the same room and trying to read the same text. Every question in our minds was going to be different. So the identity that is present in the classroom does impact the kind of questions that you ask of the past, and the kind of silences or presences or absences that you start tracing. Because the identity does work like that. What were my people doing back then? Or the people that I care about right now, the inequalities that I see in society, has it always been like this? So this is how the question sort of starts coming in. And for Romila and Kumkum also, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but they were in very different classrooms obviously as I was. And that did impact how the kind of questions that they asked. So I'm not saying the change was for good or for bad, but it did help write entirely new histories. So for Romila, writing in the nationalist, or just after the nationalist struggle, her classroom with all its representation, she writes about that being raised in a cantonment area with Anglo-Indians and so many other types of people. That does impact. Then you look for plurality in society, because you know that if 2,000 years ago people are speaking Greek and Roman and Arabic right here on these very coasts that we are sitting in, it's been a polyglot society, then there must be something to it. If they're speaking so many languages today, they must be speaking way more back then. So what is the history of this? And that's how the past and present sort of get connected. Because you look at the people around you and you look at their histories, and it doesn't just go back 3 generations to your grandpa and achacha. It just goes back a little bit furthermore.
Yeah, that's amazing, because the subjectivity of the person who's inquiring is also so important. Like, what are they looking to the past for, right? So now is probably a good time for you to read either Kumkum's or Romila's.
I think I'll read out Kumkum's a bit. Professor Roy has sent in very kindly a few words to be read out here because she couldn't make it in person. She writes, I was both excited and tense when we began working on this little book, which spans almost 90 years in our collective lives, years that have witnessed vast changes in our country as well as in the world around us. My story begins from the 1960s when I was lucky to start my formal education in Calcutta Girls High School with some incredibly kind teachers, role models one could admire but not emulate. That was also true of some of my teachers in Presidency College, so I dreamt of becoming a teacher long before I even knew what becoming a historian meant. That transition happened in the late 1970s when I joined the MA program at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, where we were introduced to a fresh set of courses designed by women and men who were at once passionate and erudite. What was novel and at that time unique about these courses was the focus on socioeconomic processes rather than on political events. We were also encouraged to work on small research projects exploring texts, inscriptions, and archaeological material, all of which proved to be extremely stimulating. This coincided with the feminist movements that were gaining ground in the late 1970s, where scholars were interrogating a whole range of existing disciplines and making a strong case for developing and adopting gendered perspectives. I was influenced by these concerns as I moved on to pursue research in the 1980s. This proved to be extremely challenging, but was also, I hope, ultimately fruitful. What I tried to explore through my doctoral dissertation was whether and how political processes could be identified through a study of ritual texts, more specifically later Vedic literature, and whether this revealed connections between explicitly political institutions, in this case kingship, and ordinary households. Did our understanding of political processes need to be gendered? And if so, how could one do so? This involved several strands: acquiring a knowledge of Sanskrit, which was by no means easy, developing theoretical insights and perspectives, and working out strategies for analyzing texts in terms of authorship, audience, structure, form, content. None of which was an individual enterprise. Fortunately, my supervisor, who I can now claim, perhaps claim as a friend, Romila Thapa, provided critical support, as did Dr. K. Meenakshi and Guruji Padmanabha Sharma, who taught me Sanskrit, and several feminist friends, researchers, teachers, and in colleges who listened patiently and shared their own insights generously. I also began teaching from the early 1980s. This brought several challenges and hopefully insights as well. I taught for more than 15 years in Satyavati College, Delhi University. Here I had to teach history courses in Hindi, and I realized how daunting this could be. As Hindi was not my mother tongue, I struggled and often still struggle with the language. For students, reading material in the language was scarce, and much of what was available was weighed down by a highly Sanskritized vocabulary that was often as familiar to the ordinary reader as the English terms. What was also starkly evident is that the linguistic divide mapped on to class and caste differences as well. Bridging this demanded energy, empathy, commitment, as well as expertise, not all of which were easily available. These barriers to inclusivity were not easy to dismantle either. When I joined CHS JNU as a teacher, several faculty members and senior students worked to create space for addressing the needs of students whose access to English was limited. However, the success of these efforts was transient, primarily because they were viewed as extrinsic to the main academic curriculum, whose weight often overwhelmed less privileged students. Issues of language and accessibility remain major stumbling blocks in education, in communication. Amongst the many things that one hopes will be achieved in the years ahead is more writing in our regional languages, which have very rich resources and traditions of scholarship, as well as the preparation and publication of accessible translations. At another level, many of us try to introduce a gendered analysis into specific history courses. This, we discovered, was a virtually impossible uphill task. While colleagues were willing to make a concession by including a few topics or themes, the idea that gender inclusivity implied reviewing the entire discipline from a gendered perspective as also including and acknowledging differences amongst women and men in terms of class, caste, region, sexual orientation, religious beliefs, found few takers. There is a long way to go before this is achieved. It was in Satyavati College that some of us women teachers began trying to create a more gender-sensitive work environment in the college. This was again by no means easy. It involved negotiations with the bureaucracy as well as with college authorities, and we discovered that generating and sustaining interest among students and colleagues was neither instantaneous nor permanent. However, we did make some headway, and friends realized that while our concern with gender issues shaped our academic work, they also extended to our context, both immediate and wider. Many of these concerns remained in place through the years that I taught in JNU, where there was, for several years, a vibrant and effective committee against sexual harassment, which was regarded as a model for the country. Also, we witnessed the setting up of a small yet innovative Center for Women Studies. The relationship between women's studies and more mainstream entrenched disciplines such as history has sometimes been complicated. At the same time, the potential of an enriching interaction remains a long-term goal. Another strand that I would like to touch on is the process of writing on textbooks for school children. While I was introduced to this through the initiative of friends in Eklavya, who considered me an expert in ancient Indian history, I soon realized how much there was to learn in terms of modes of communication. The relevance of themes that we often took for granted, the use of visual material, designing exercises that could be exciting and productive for learners, and much more. Two concluding observations. While thanks to social media, the public perception of history is of a discipline mired in controversy, it remains both invaluable and indispensable, challenging learners to come to terms with diversity, complexity, the contingent nature of our worlds, and uncertainties. Secondly, while the small volume that we have contributed to focuses on three of us, what we have been able to do, with all its limitations, would have been impossible without the consistent support and encouragement of many people, family, friends, colleagues, students, and others. What would make this endeavor worthwhile is the documentation and sharing many more such histories of practitioners, researchers, and students cutting across divides of language, caste, class, community, and sexual orientation. This would enrich not only our understanding of the discipline, but may lead to development of a more inclusive, diverse academic environment, which is perhaps one of the most pressing needs of our times.
Thank you so much for reading that. I think you deserve to drink some water now. So I think what she said about, the interaction between these different disciplines and how in the future there should be more writing in regional languages and all of that is so important, right? And that's like something that needs to happen and is happening in the Indian academia, I suppose. It's slowly, perhaps. But now I want to sort of, talk a little bit more about your own work and what your sort of specialization is. Just let me take a sip and then I'll ask you. So your work is to do with food and power in early Indian text, right? So you look into the symbolism of what food represents, like what you abstaining or consuming certain foods, what that means, how that defines one's role and status in societies and stuff like that. So tell us a little bit about your work and your perspective on how you approach these things.
So a lot to sort of spring forward from what Kumkum said, where her work looked at how political institutions are gendered. Now we are building on this further. There is a theory that this is what religious philosophy means, this is what it means to be a Buddhist, this is what it means to be a Kshatriya, sure. But people are not reading these texts. Till as late as 1947, our literacy rate was what, 12%, 20%? So if people are not reading these texts, how are all these ideas becoming visible? And that's where praxis or practice becomes important. So food, amongst other things, becomes one of the most visible manifestations through which conditioning is happening, through which performance is happening, how my rites of passage, marriage, birth, death, what kind of food is served, how it's served, who I feed, who I don't feed. That's all a very loud declaration of my identity, right down at all levels, whether I'm a part of a community or I've been outcasted, whether I am being looked down upon. It's not just for the dead person's identity, but also for the living. So it is claiming affiliation in an identity. Now, in ancient India, when we look at this, what I'll do is a comparative analysis of texts like the Ramayana, Valmiki's Ramayana in Sanskrit, and Buddhist Jatakas. Valmiki's Ramayana has no space for any other religion, and yet it uses food in so many ways to address all these different sects that have existed without taking their names. So how do you identify somebody as the other? Oh, their food practices are different. They are gluttons. They eat humans, you know. So you'll demonize the other, as it's happening even sadly in our country even today. You demonize the other by demonizing their food practices. So there lies something far deeper, ideological, philosophical, cultural control. But to make it visible, to make it sort of tangible, you use food very often. How I got into that is, again, the politics of the country, very sadly. By the time I was entering research is when mob lynchings were just about beginning. So the fact that you can eat a certain kind of meat and get the wrath of people to the extent that they can kill you, that's what the question came up. Said, okay, what have people been doing about later? And that then again sort of revealed these crossroads, that it's not just about the everydayness of religion. How should the king eat? What makes a good appetite for a king, or what makes a good appetite for an ascetic? How you should not eat? So the person's relationship with food became a marker of how well they are doing their chosen vocation, for a better word. So there are different kinds of ascetics in ancient India. And their entire relationship is determined by whether they eat food, they don't eat food, whether they accept food, they don't accept food. And then we know that, again, there are people who we can't see in these texts because of their elite gaze. So what kind of food were people eating outside of these texts? And how was their relationship? What kind of foods have been termed polluted? It is never in the nature of food that is pure or polluted. It is the context or the actor that bestows the purity or deems it polluting. And that's something that what saddens is that problem with studying ancient Indian history is sometimes when you're deep in those texts, sometimes you look around and you look up and you say, oh, wow, the world hasn't changed. And we're talking about 2,000 years. Yeah. Everything has changed. Yes. But some things haven't.
So, I mean, whatever you're saying is so interesting to me. I could pick on so many things that I want to know more about. But right now, since we're talking about women writing history, I'm talking about women. So could you speak a little bit about women, how women feature in this narrative of food and power, and also about, women renunciants and what they were eating or not eating, or how, about those dynamics?
Sorry, I'll be going a little back and forth. The journey of food in history, it has been studied by so many subjects. We spoke about transdisciplinary ideas. The reason why sociology, anthropology or gender studies turned to food in the last 20 years was in a way to look at spaces that have been demarcated as women's spaces. So the household, what's happening in terms of that labor. When this came to history, I can't find writings by women in ancient India for obvious reasons, but I could find what was seen as women's jobs. And that's the stark part, that yes, the household and the preparation of food is there for women, but also not. It is seen to be a very ritual task. And then we find people, the Theri Gathas, it's one among the first poems composed by women anywhere in the world. And these were the first Buddhist nuns to be writing. They composed these poems about how they turned to Buddhism, and it's been preserved. And what are the things they write about? I'm done with this drudgery of the kitchen. I'm done with the mortar and pestle, and I'm going.
That could be women today.
Absolutely, absolutely, right? But that's how they looked at religion, as a refuge. It was not something, for some of these women at least, They are coping with the loss of their child. They are coping with widowhood. They are coping with extreme beauty, that they have a line of suitors that they don't want to get married to at all. So they come from so many different sort of positions. Some are begging on the streets already. They've been left destitute. And this is what religion is to them, not something that is shackling them down, but it's a refuge. So going into a monastery, shaving off your head and leaving everything behind and taking up a lifestyle that requires begging for food, but in these, robes where you are seen as a bhikkhuni, as a shramani, as an almswoman, as a Buddhist nun, that for them is freedom. It may not be what maybe like you and I may not be able to relate it, but because we've been running away from religion for a large part of our lives. But religion itself is so complex that in each different context and situation, it's not just that religion uses or conditions women. Women are also finding those ways and niches within that religious space to live out their lives. So it is very much a two-way street.
Yeah, that's what's fascinating, right? Because although there is a silence, obviously they must have been doing these things. What is interesting to me is how women pass on things to women, how grandmothers pass on these practices or ideas to their children, to their daughters especially. And we often think of, like you were saying, these ritual things that women do in the household as part of the ritual sort of a thing. Well, how do you think that women sort of mold these things, which you're just talking about, right? And how do you sort of find that in ancient texts? How do you fathom that?
So I think the best way that I've also learned from my teachers is I don't go looking for women in the text. The text reveals itself. And again, to sort of build on the previous question on sexuality, I don't go with the assumption that when I look for food, I'll find women. I'm open. So sexuality, like gender, is not about being a woman. It's about how society has multiple roles. So being a woman is defined in context to being a man. So sexuality that way is also, it's dialogic. It's not, you don't just have these ideas of what is to be a woman. The list for what it is to be a woman, one, that's not universal. It won't be the same list as how to be a good ganika or a courtesan, or how to be a good queen, or how to be a queen slave. All three of them are completely different women. And all of them are being identified not in their own terms, but as part of a larger society. So what is common between the queen and the dasi or their respective relationship with food? Not much. And that's what food or these activities are able to highlight, the differences within gender, the differences within a sexuality. That even an identity of a woman will be marked also by the intersections of class, caste, and region, and language, and economics. And that's what sort of the turn to food or activities is able to come in, sort of help us with. For these renunciant women, it's interesting to imagine this alternative world where, as I said, they come from so many different backgrounds. Now will they sit and eat the same food? Yeah. Is the experience the same for the widowed Chanda walking the streets in Vaishali, or this trader's daughter who's had a very privileged birth? Is there an equality? And that's the fun, to look at these texts where their mentor is also not going to be Gautam Buddha, their mentor is going to be a woman as well. So within that, how do those knowledges pass on, and how do they what are the things that they train each other in is worth looking at in relation. It only makes sense when you look at it in relation to what's happening in the other world. So there's no status of women. And I think that's something we've also had very often, that I don't want to do the status of femininity. I also want to look at masculinity. What kind of, male roles are being sort of written? That's as much a part of feminist historiography as any other. How is masculinity being defined? Masculinity for the king, masculinity for the forest dweller is very different. And those also sort of comment a lot on ideas of gender and sexuality in ancient India.
That's so cool because a lot of work that I do is queering feminism. So, in ancient India too. So that's so interesting. We have about 5 minutes. So let's see if anybody here has questions, or if not, I will ask you a question myself. So anybody in the audience who's been listening, if anybody has any questions, she is an expert in ancient India. So, so you can ask her any questions you have about that time period. Okay, then I will ask you my question.
Sure.
Okay, so maybe it doesn't have to do so much with the rest of the conversation we had so far, but because you know the Ramayanas so well, I was just wondering about women's agencies within these texts. If you can just tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll end our session. Tough question.
That depends. Yeah, I'm thinking where to start. So it's also a course I teach, and it's something that has always attracted more girls than boys. And they always get a bit riled up. I think the Ramayana is a great place to start, if for anything, to look at intersectionality. What is a good woman? And who's not a good woman? So very simply put, in the Ramayana tradition, there's Sita, who's the best woman that there exists. And there's Surpanakha, who's in some ways the reason why it all started, at least in the Valmiki's Ramayana. Not to go into that binary, but when we look at many Ramayanas, why is it that there are certain plot points that attract the attention of so many authors, so many rewritings, so many retellings? Because there is a sense of unjust. So even till about 5 years ago, I remember a woman MP was laughing in the parliament, and she shut down saying, "Don't laugh like Surpanakha." So there are some things that have, stayed. And what I'd like to argue in other words is also that the reason why these retellings come up, and where we see it as historians, is always these ways in which how can I reclaim that space against the dominant narrative. So whether that narrative is about how to be a good woman, how to be a good woman is defined by being subservient to the house, being, good to the family, sort of follow your husband to the forest, and so on and so forth. Are there any other ways in which I can be me and still be good? Not to create a ruckus or a riot in society, but I do think I'm a good woman, but it may not match the narratives or the to-do list that has been given by Valmiki. So what are these various ways in which women did exist? And what is it that sort of troubled so much? What is it about the woman not following the husband, let's say in a household, or like Surpanakha, falling in love with a man of her choice that was so troublesome that not only today but over the 2000 years has spawned so many tales? What is it? Why does Kampan in Tamil Iramavataram get so grotesque about and so graphic about Surpanakha's mutilation, far more than any other narrative? So is it to do with the region? Is it to do with the cultural context? These are sort of questions that come up when we look at these sources, and that's important. I don't know if I should answer the questions or the raising is enough to think.
I think raising the questions is, I think everyone will come up to their own conclusions in their minds and read her work. So she has a new book out, so with Kumkum and Romila Thopper. So thank you so much.
Actually, before I go, can I just read Romila's portion?
Of course, you just have a little bit to read.
Yeah, I'll just read out Romila's sort of the end part of what she's written. As it turns out, she turns 94 today. Anyway.
Happy birthday, Romila.
Yeah. There have been and are women historians who have written on the history of women in various times in India. This has seen the articulation of women's history in a form not too different from before. The presence of women in history was treated as an undifferentiated, vague and vast presence, parallel to that of women in general, except that women were subordinated to men. Little was said about the role of women in shaping society, but their presence was noticed. Woman was a single category. The change from this was the significant departure from seeing women as an alternative mass to men and to start classifying women into their own diverse identities such that they were identifiable in terms of social and economic class, of occupation, of culture, in the sense of patterns of living and of religious roles. The variegated society of women, how these came about and how they functioned as a distinctive aspect of the entire society began to be formulated. To an equal degree, it was important to construct the context of the activities of women so that they too could be seen as helping shape a society. What surfaced was not just the role of women and their activities, but also the perspectives of women historians interpreting in the past history of women in Indian society. The recognition of the category of women in various capacities helped to clarify the explanation of historical change. So it's not enough to be a woman and write a straightforward history of women. One has to have a further commitment to being a liberated woman, to be able to hover over these activities and comment on them at various points of time. The woman historian of today has to be aware of what it means to be a liberated woman in order to understand and recognize and then proceed to explain the differences in being a woman in varying sections of a society and how this defines the freedom of women differently. This has to be recognized even if the reference is to the same tradition. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That was so inspiring, right? Romila can inspire us from anywhere.
Yeah.
Thank
Even
you.
through text.
Yeah, thank you, Preeti. Thank you so much for being here. You have a question. Okay.
In Rig Veda, it's mentioned the drink of Soma. This Indra was a Soma drinker. The entire subcontinent, I don't see Soma grown anywhere. Was it grown in Central Asia? Which means all these battles mentioned between Asura and Devas were all in Central Asian area, Caspian Sea. And
you know, the intersectionality that she questioned, I'd need the help of a few biologists to help answer that question. Because again, we can't sort of look at face value if the Rig Veda is being written around the Punjab region of today. That's where it's being composed and sort of written about. Which plant does the Soma plant refer to? And we have to keep in mind that in the last 3,500 years, Rig Veda goes back to 1500, we've been 3,500 years, the amount of changes that have happened to the national geography around us, from what the British brought in to what the entire changes that have been happening since then, it is not minuscule at all. So one of the things that I've learned from my teachers is to not jump from 3,500 years past and present, because every single century that happened in the middle was important. In short, I don't know which is the Soma plant in real life. I'm sure certain biologists know that, but you know, there were many other intoxicants that we see mentioned in the text, even when renunciants are talking about medical intoxication, as well as something that is looked down upon. So Ashoka in his edicts, what Romila has written so beautifully about, he says that no, don't go to these festivals because they'll have intoxicants. So Soma is not the only intoxicant that they knew. That's my takeaway.
No going to
they
the
had
raves.
many others. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, this will be the last question we'll be able to take.
Yeah. More a reflection than a question. Do we think the status of women and the power that we had back in the ancient days to now, where do we think things are better? Do we think they're the same? Do we think they're worse?
But which women? The queens had a very different life
So
from the
true.
slave women. As is true even today. Yeah. My life was very different from my classmates who were first generation learners. I cannot begin to compare.
Yeah.
But all our lives were marked by being women. But being a woman does not mean a single thing today, yesterday, day before, or 300 years ago, or 3,000 years ago. And that's what we are trying to get to it. That let's look at what constitutes, if I'm talking about my life, what are these activities that constitute being a woman? And to raise that question, it is not universal at all. Just like being a man is not universal, just like being a trans woman is not being universal.
Yeah.
So none of these categories should be taken universal at all.
Okay.